Be a man who can face everything without fear. Be a man who can face failure and still rise. Be a man who can face pain and not let it break him. Be a man who can face loss and still give love. Be a man who can face the world when it turns its back. Be a man who can face the storm and walk through it. Be a man who can face pressure and stay calm. Be a man who can face hate and respond with strength. Be a man who can face the truth even when it hurts. Be a man who can face his flaws and fix them. Be a man who can face loneliness and still keep going. Be a man who can face betrayal and stay noble. Be a man who can face change and keep his values. Be a man who can face the darkness and still find light. Be a man who can face his past and learn from it. Be a man who can face hard times without blaming others. Be a man who can face temptation and walk away. Be a man who can face rejection and not lose confidence. Be a man who can face chaos and create order. Be a man who can face weakness and build strength. Be a man who can face anger and choose peace. Be a man who can face failure and not quit. Be a man who can face doubt and still believe. Be a man who can face silence and not feel empty. Be a man who can face injustice and stand up. Be a man who can face criticism and grow. Be a man who can face the unknown and trust the path. Be a man who can face his emotions and not bury them. Be a man who can face guilt and seek redemption. Be a man who can face mistakes and make them right. Be a man who can face fear and still move forward. Be a man who can face brokenness and still be whole. Be a man who can face the mirror and be proud. Be a man who can face responsibility and not run from it. Be a man who can face the pain of others and offer comfort. Be a man who can face failure with dignity. Be a man who can face success with humility. Be a man who can face pressure without folding. Be a man who can face criticism without changing his core. Be a man who can face stress without breaking. Be a man who can face his demons and still fight. Be a man who can face hardship and remain grateful. Be a man who can face judgment and still stand tall. Be a man who can face disappointment and keep hope. Be a man who can face life with purpose. Be a man who can face battles and still choose peace. Be a man who can face the worst and bring out his best. Be a man who can face everything and still be kind. Be a man who can face everything and still believe in himself. Be a man who can face everything and never lose his soul. Subscribe our channel for more motivational videos.